Okay, we're going to address something here that we did not do in class, because frankly we would have finished it probably in review in class or into the next chapter. But it does come up periodically, and it's just using some terms that we've used before. We're just going to use them in a little different way. All right, when we're talking about industry and development, right, there's one theory that comes up frequently. Is called Weber's least cost theory, right? He's an economic geographer, so he is basically looking at how to locate places, plants in particular, to take advantage of costs, right? To make things the least cost so you can make the most money. So if we're looking at Weber's least cost theory, it's done in a series of triangles. And all the triangles basically mean the same thing. We're just going to move this middle part, right? This is the plant. P stands for plant, where you make things, the production plant. M is market, right? Where you're going to sell them. And R is raw materials. So typically in Weber's theory, you have two raw materials, right? 1 and 2. And what Weber wants to do is to look at the location of the raw materials, the weight of the raw materials. That's a big factor because we know heavier things cost more to transport, right? So that's part of what his cost theory is, transportation. Because like von Thunen and other theories before, right, transportation is the most expensive. We're going to talk about why that's a little bit different now in a minute. But if you are looking at all things being equal, right, everybody has the same costs. Nobody gets a break, right? So it's equal across the board, right? So if you have a raw material here and a raw material here, R1 and R2, and they weigh the same, right? You're going to put your plant in the middle, right? It's going to be in between raw material 1 and raw material 2, equal distance, because the costs are going to be the same. If I put it over here, that increases the cost for raw materials, right? So if I move it away from the raw material, I pay more cost, right? So with the first one, you have raw material 2, they are both equal weight, right? And then you are also going to put it equal distance to the market, right? One of the things that you're assuming here is that when I take raw material 1 and 2 and put it together, the end product doesn't weigh any more or less than the raw material itself, right? So if raw material is 5 pounds and raw material 1 is 5 pounds, raw material 2 is 5 pounds, I bring it together and I make a 5-pound product, right? Then I'm going to have my materials, right, or my road market's going to be the same, so I'm going to put it here in the middle, right? Best cost. But we know that that doesn't work all that way sometimes, right? So what Weber puts into his theory are two additional scenarios, one with a weight gaining industry and a weight losing industry, all right? So if we're looking at a weight gaining industry, right? That means that basically where you have raw materials that you put together, right? And that the end product is actually heavier than the raw materials itself. Okay, so that is a weight gaining. That's this one here over on the far right. Right, so when I take 5 pounds here and 5 pounds here of the raw materials and I put them together, they're going to weigh 10 pounds. Right, so heavier materials means higher transportation costs, so I'm going to put my plant closer to the market. Right, so I can cut down on my transportation going to market. Right, so weight gaining. So let's say I'm making washing machines, right, and I'm taking steel and aluminum. I don't know how to make a washing machine, so I'm going to assume that. So let's say that steel and aluminum, I put them together, they're going to be heavier, right, than if I go when I put it together. So my market, I want to be closer to the market. The one here in the middle is an example of a weight reducing industry, right? Where the raw materials themselves weigh more than the finished product, right? What does that mean? Let's talk about potato chips. All right. So if I have potatoes and let's say salt, all right. So potatoes and salt. Potatoes weigh a lot. Salt, put it in a big truck, I guess it weighs a lot, right? But when I put them together into potato chips, right, weighs a lot less, considering also the fact that that bag is just full of air, right? So they may be bulky, but they're not heavy. If I have a weight reducing industry, I'm going to save on transportation costs by moving my plant towards the raw materials, right? Because it's going to be cheaper to take a lighter product and move it up here to the market, right? So everything being equal, weight gaining, weight reducing. The last one is, and I'm just putting it in here for fun because I think it's cute, is called the brick bunny. All right. It's weird, but it's a brick bunny. All right. So let's say that I'm going to make bunnies out of bricks. All right. Bricks are heavy raw material. I'm going to make the fur out of feathers. Feathers don't weigh very much at all. All right. I'm literally going to move, and in most cases it would be even closer. All right. I'm going to put my plant closer to the bricks, probably actually equidistant between the market and the bricks, right? Why? Because the bricks are always going to weigh the same. I'm not really adding any additional weight when I put feathers on them, right? So I'm going to save on transportation costs by being closer to the bricks and closer to the market and further away from my least deal. It's ridiculous, but you know what? That's kind of the way economics works sometimes. Sorry, Mr. Walden, but there's just some crazy stuff. All right, let's move on to goals. All right, before you get to this part of if you're following along on the materials, there's a whole bunch of stuff about different locations of industrial zones across the globe. I'm not certain they're going to be that picky, but I would suggest that you read it. It does have a discussion of things that we've talked about, like special economic zones. So you might want to be familiar with that. They also talk about something called the Asian tigers. The Asian tigers are 4 countries, locations: Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. These countries, and Hong Kong being a region, have gained tremendously as far as industrial development. Right? They are fiercely competitive, fast growing, really reaching out and grabbing territory, hence the name tigers. Sometimes they take the Asian off because Asian sounds somewhat disrespectful. But they are fastly promoting this area of the country, right? And the development in that area is growing tremendously. All right, let's talk about ways to measure development. We know that just because a country has a product doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be developed. There's a lot of stuff into it, and that's where we're going to go in this measure of development, right? And before we get into those measures, right, we know that we've looked at the Millennial Development Goals that were set by the United Nations, that were set in 2000 and meant to be in effect by 2015, and there were 8 of them. In 2015, they reevaluated those goals and set them to 17 sustainable development goals, so they reconfigured it a bit. You can see that there are some adjustments to that. In the original goals, it was to eliminate extreme poverty and extreme hunger. Now 1 and 2 are to end poverty in all forms, to end hunger and attain food security for everybody. Right? So they've gotten to be a bit more end everything as opposed to just making some progress, right? You need to be familiar, not with the goals in and of themselves, but the fact is that this is a program of the United Nations that people are trying to work on to achieve some level of quality of life for people around the world, right? To work on things like climate change, economic inequality, sustainable consumption, peace, justice, right? And a lot of sustainability issues as well, right? So just be familiar with those. So as we are looking at these goals and we're trying to decide how to best achieve them, we need to know how to measure it, right? And we've talked at the very beginning of when we talked about development, we talked about gross national product, gross domestic product, gross national income, right? You're going to need to know how to measure these, right? Gross national product deals with the value of goods and services that are produced by citizens and corporations of a country. Means those that are produced inside the physical boundaries of the United States, plus those that are produced somewhere else. We know a lot of companies have factories all over the world. Those are included in gross national product. If we're going to do gross domestic product, we're only looking at the stuff that's made inside the United States, right? Inside the boundaries. And gross domestic income not only includes things that are made inside the United States, but also looks at basically imports and exports, investments in and out of the country. So what we import goes against gross national income. What we export raises gross national income, right? We know that it's not fair to compare these across the board with other countries, so we do a per capita, right, or divide it by the amount of the population, right, so that we have an assignment per each individual person that lives in the country. Yet we also know that that is not always the best way to be able to measure development. Because if we look at gross national product across the United States, it'll say something like $70,000 per person, but we know that in some places it's higher, some places it's much lower, right? Gross national product, domestic product, GNI, whatever, doesn't tell us where that kind of number is achieved and where it's exceeded or where it's not met at all, right? So it's a general number, but not necessarily one that's completely satisfactory. Right, another way to look at this is the Human Development Index, again, another United Nations program that looks at some of the things that go into making a quality of life, right? How long can you expect to live? What kind of standard of living might you have? And what's your knowledge, right? Where do you get to go to school? Is your country very literate, right? We know that countries that are core, we'll talk about core in a minute, but the core countries, what you may see sometimes in review are called MDCs, more developed countries, right, tend to be higher on that index than countries that are LDCs or less developed countries, right? So again, the core looks good, the semi-periphery right in the middle, and then the periphery are the ones that are typically on the bottom. One of the things that I want you to notice in this map as well, if you look at where are our core countries, right? They are almost exclusively on the north side of the equator, right? Core countries are almost exclusively here, right? So when you join the core, you are typically in the northern hemisphere. The exceptions to that, of course, are Australia and New Zealand, right? But they are even considered northern hemisphere for purposes of the core. They're kind of the exception that they're below the equator, but they were both colonies of a above the equator, right, country, the United Kingdom. So above the equator typically is core, below the equator, periphery and semi-periphery. And you might see that on occasion somewhere. All right. Human Development Index kind of uses things more than just the GDP, GNI kind of measurements, but they also look at more of a quality of life, right? So you want to have a high Human Development Index. All right. When we're also looking at measurement of development, we want to see what is it that people are doing? What kinds of jobs are they involved in? And I'm gonna about run out of time, so I'm gonna stop here, and we'll pick this up in the next video.